On the screen is Brian Peck, whose name has resurfaced in the last few months because of the Quiet on the Set documentary, which features on a lot of the predators in the Hollywood industry that seems probably to be there since its inception. But this clown was the pedo that came out that he had abused the actor Drake Bell during the time of the Amanda Show. So I wanted to touch a little bit about this guy and his background and what I think is going on here. So this guy, he also played, by the way, Pickle Boy was one of the characters he did portray. So I think there's in a lot of these shows and stuff that are run by these pedos, they do a lot of kind of very subtle things, and a lot of the stuff that appears on screen, and a lot of just really creepy innuendos, and you kind of see that repeating itself over and over again. Although Pickle Boy would not be one of the more subtle ones. He had done a couple of things in the early 80s, Brian Peck, that is, and he was on a show, which I remember being a child of the 80s, Growing Pains. He was on that show, and he had several different titles. He was a, director, dialogue coach. I think he was a body double, and just an, overall just shitty person. But he was on that show from 85 to 92, and then he goes on to work on the sitcom Boy Meets World from 93 to 2000, and he also worked on the Amanda Show from 1999 until 2002. And he was arrested in August of 2003, and he was charged initially with 11 counts of lewd conduct with a minor. Now the child's name for a very long time was kept anonymous, but now we know that it is the actor Drake Bell, who Peck worked with on the Amanda Show. And he ended up only getting convicted. And you see this pattern over and over again with these just complete joke of sentences that these chomos get hit with. And it's just the same over and over, these ridiculous lenient sentences. And this time he only got convicted of 2 of the 11 counts, and he got 16 months in prison. He was able to, or he had to also register as a sex offender. So that was in 2003, in which he was arrested. And, just incredibly, somehow after his release from prison, he got a job. He went back to working, right back into Hollywood, right back into, the same kind of circles he was running in before. And he managed to get a job after prison with Disney on the television show The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, which is just, you're probably wondering yourself, well, how the fuck could that happen? How could this guy be then, he got hired by Disney? And you see this as well with Disney, Nickelodeon, these massive billion-dollar, million-dollar companies that somehow have some of the shittiest HR departments that I've ever heard of. But they then allege that once they became aware of his background, they fired him and got rid of him, and he no longer worked on that show with Disney. How they didn't know that ahead of time is, they'll probably chalk it up to he just fell through the cracks, just incompetence. I guess the HR department at Disney, was staffed with a bunch of, homeless people from the streets. Nobody nobody picked up on the fact that this guy not only had worked in the industry for a very long time, but he was arrested for some pretty heinous things. Just flew over the head of the HR department at Disney. And he was also, I'm going to play a video that you probably saw of, and a lot of people have seen the video, but basically of him behind the scenes of the show Growing Pains with the young Leonardo DiCaprio. I think Leonardo was 16 at the time, and this was basically like his big break in the industry. Now, Growing Pains at the time was a massive show. It was a much different world. There was no internet, no streaming services. I mean, we, didn't even have cable, I think, at the time. So it was just basically like whatever your local television channels were, Fox, NBC, ABC, CBS. You maybe had channel from like 2 to 13. Anyway, so Growing Pains was a huge show at the time, and it had been on for several years when Leonardo DiCaprio, I think he played like a cousin or something on the show, or some sort of family friend, and that the family the Seavers brought on, and that was, the beginning of his ascent through Hollywood and, to What's Eating Gilbert Grape, Basketball Diaries, Titanic, and, so on to the, I guess, A-list status that he has, today. So here's that video I wanted to play real quick.
You see, we draw drawings of each other. Brian is the famous artist, and we always make fun of each other and portray each other in silly satirical ways.
Leo's job on this set, for some reason, to make fun of me all day long. Leo, as you know, is the latest, hottest, hunkiest teen idol there is.
Yeah, muscles.
Speaking of hunky,
You see,
And just a really kind of just uneasy feeling in that scene. You could just kind of tell the inappropriateness. Again, what happened past that is just, speculation. So you have Brian Peck, who's working on this show. And you also have another person on this show who I want to, let's see here, I wanted to talk about, and that was another producer who was eventually arrested, and his name was Stephen Marshall, and he was 67 years old at the time of his arrest. Yeah, this was an article from Little Rock, Arkansas. Was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison, given probation for life. Stephen Marshall, 67-year-old, was once an executive producer on the 80s sitcom Growing Pains and a writer for WKRP in Cincinnati, which was a big show, I believe, in the 70s. And police have been contacted. I guess it was like an undercover operation, and it says here, calling himself Papa in 1953, Marshall had approached the undercover officer in a chat room about guilty groups, admitting that if the officer liked to trade pictures, and noting that he had images of both girls and boys. They exchanged some of these pornographic images. Marshall then further explained that he prefers children up to 10 years old. He also sent the undercover officer images of child pornography, asking him to return the favor, and he sent a photograph of himself engaged in sexual activity. Said that affidavit said that Marshall told his online friend, the male undercover officer from Missouri, that he had first molested a toddler when he was 13 years old. Snippets of an online conversation between the two men were included in the affidavit. Some of it was blocked out. talking about a young girl that he had raped. Marshall replied, yes, but I was stronger. She was only 11 at the time. She got with it eventually. It's just disgusting stuff to hear somebody talking like that, and just really vile stuff. He and the officer discussed a photograph of Marshall having sex with a 9-year-old girl. I turned her into a total slut, he bragged. He likes to watch the videotapes. He recorded himself afterwards. And quote, we pedos need to stick together, he said, admitting to being a pedo since the age of 13 when he molested a 2-year-old girl. And he also apparently shared himself of a photograph of Marshall and a 15-year-old boy, and didn't have any prior convictions. Yeah. Anyway, so they go on about his charges. So he got sentenced to about 7.5 years in prison, and at that age, I mean, he was 67, so he didn't really, go back to work with Hollywood, unlike Brian Peck, at least that I could find. So, yeah, you can see that. So you have Brian Peck, you have, Stephen Marshall, you have, Dan Schneider. So you have all of these 3 people, and 2 of them are on Growing Pains, and then they basically go on to work on the same shows after that on Nickelodeon. And those weren't the only ones that came out in the documentary. There were a couple of other people that seemingly somehow, again, got hired on to Nickelodeon television, a show on these shows working with young children, despite the fact that they had prior, sexual molestation charges, sexual crime charges against children. Prior convictions, somehow they still got hired, which is just, you kind of can't really, it's a difficult thing to reconcile how, they can be just so, just so incompetent, which leads me to believe that there's something else going on other than just incompetence. Brian Peck was also a very, very well-known with other actors, Charlie Sheen being one of them, good friends with him. Also, that was covered in the documentary, that when he got arrested in 2003, you had all of these Hollywood types coming out of the woodwork, writing letters of support for him. Alan Thicke, there's a bunch of people, and then after this documentary came out, they all kind of some of them we didn't mean that, and we didn't realize the gravity of the situation, and a bunch of fucking nonsense, if you ask me. Most of those people, I'm sure, were probably well aware what the fuck was going on, and, you could draw your own connections to that. But yeah, this guy, he knew a lot of people. Charlie Sheen, another child actor, his father, Martin Sheen, a well-known actor, and you see a lot of this kind of same stuff over and over again. They were also on these Nickelodeon shows, that those weren't the, only, like I said, pedos on there. There was a guy named that I was covered as well, Jason Handy, who, again, very similar. I'm going to show you some quotes that he was caught with, but this was another guy. These people insulate themselves, which is really disgusting, but they insulate themselves, in positions where they have constant access to children, TV, Nickelodeon, or church groups, or schools, or daycares, or hospitals. It's really the way that they navigate is something that just really shows the true evil that these people have in them. Anyway, this guy, Jason Handy, He was a production assistant on the shows for Nickelodeon, production assistant at some of the most nationally prominent kids television programs, but also volunteered at a Malibu church as an aide for 6-year-olds. This means he had unwavering access to minors at almost all times. His primary role at Nickelodeon was to escort child actors around while ensuring none of their parents. So basically, take care of a lot of the logistics with the children and keep the parents at, arm's distance, because because they're child actors legally, from what I understand, the parents can be on the set and around their kids at all times. And so he was kind of, just running a little interference. It says he was apparently very charismatic and charming. Just did his best to personally converse with these caretakers during his breaks. Little did they know, that they were basically, walking their children into the lion's den by allowing this guy around them. So it goes on to say that he sent one of these young girls a graphic photo of himself, and she, the mother never reported this incident to the police because she didn't want the kid to be further traumatized, yet they did mutually decide to step out of the business for good after that. And then somehow the police got tipped off to him about 2003 after receiving a tip about Jason having a lot of inappropriate materials at his Sherman Oaks residence. Police raided the home. Turns out over 1,700 images of minors in explicit positions, 7 child pornographic videos, as well as several tagged in Ziploc bags. And this is just really disgusting. Just each of the Ziploc bags reported consist of various tokens from the different girls that he had taken. He also had the 28-year-old's personal diary was also found by authorities. In it, just like Stephen Marshall did, he referred to himself as a pedophile full-blown with a consuming desire for little girls. One of the entries also read, in part, I even struggle on a day-to-day basis of how I can find a victim to grape if I have to. And, you would think with all of that found in his home, again, what happened to him? Well, basically nothing. He pled no contest to lewd acts on a minor, distributing explicit material. He was then sentenced to a total of 6 years behind bars, yet was released early on parole in 2009. So he just did a few years out of a 6-year sentence, was released, went back to North Carolina as a registered sex offender, and not a shock to anybody, he got arrested again. In North Carolina, 3 counts of felony indecent liberties. And he's actually, in this time, he's incarcerated at a low-medium security federal correctional institution in Virginia, and he's supposed to be released in 2038. So this was another person, on the staff. They're just like the rest of them. Just like you have Stephen Marshall, you have Brian Peck, you have Dan Schneider, you have Jason Handy. And it just goes on, and this is just a few shows. So the next person I wanted to talk about briefly is another person who's part of these networks, who was also mentioned in the documentary. And I actually had heard this guy's name many years back. This guy Marty Weiss, who I believe it was Corey Feldman, like way back in the day, had mentioned this guy's name as one of the people who were the abusers of, Corey Feldman and Corey Haim, allegedly. It starts off, a lot of time and effort for Corey Feldman to make My Truth. He had mentioned several people that he had worked with back in the 80s who had essayed him. And then he gets into more. In 2017, he had accused Marty Weiss of being one of the offenders and also mentioned him in his memoir. But Weiss had already been in a lot of trouble before Corey's revelations. And there is a picture of this clown. And he was in 80s made a name for himself in the 80s Hollywood as a talent manager who primarily worked with child actors, again, insulating themselves in these positions. His clients would land parts in the projects on TV channels like Nickelodeon and Disney, iCarly, Jack and Jill, The Muppets, Good Luck Charlie, among the several shows that have employed Weiss's clients. And it goes on. And I wanted to touch on, so this guy, again, in 2012, he was sentenced to prison. They had caught him on a wiretap with one of the victims, admitting to some of this stuff. And the police arrested Weiss in his apartment, was combed over. They didn't find anything. He pled not guilty on the 8 counts of lewd acts with a child. And he settled for a plea bargain. And basically, again, the justice system completely just dropping the ball. He settled for a plea bargain that helped him get a lighter sentence. He was sentenced to a year in jail, 5 years probation, while 6 of the charges were dropped as part of the deal. And he did 6 months in fucking jail. He was released for good behavior. And is a free man, and apparently has been active on social media, firing back at some of these accusations by Corey Feldman. And I'm not going to read the rest of this because it's a bunch of nonsense. But, this is another kind of layer of, so you have the producers, the directors, the dialogue coach, the talent manager who's bringing them the kids. You just have, all around these children. And, you can see, man, how this could happen, that if you're not one of those parents who is on the set watching every single move, then there's a good chance that, they're going to try to distance the parents and, isolate the child. And that's how a lot of this stuff goes down. And, especially when obviously the parents at the time are not going to realize that, holy shit, like there's the audio video guy, he's a pedo, the talent manager's a pedo, and you're surrounded by all of these just complete monsters. You would have no idea. So really the only way to, escape that is to have like a really hands-on parent who's there at all times watching everything, because once the isolation starts, that's when the grooming starts. And going back to the Growing Pains show, it's funny because I remember I watched that show a lot as a kid, and I liked the show, and I liked the Mike Seaver, the actor Kirk Cameron, who played Mike Seaver in the show, was like the main character. But I also remember as a child watching the show, it's funny because I look back at it now and I'm like, but there was and even as a kid, I don't know, I'm 10, 12 years old at the time, watching this show, and I always found it very strange that on the show, Mike Seaver, Kirk Cameron's character, who was, I don't know, like a teenager, maybe 15, 16 at the time in the show, he was like in high school, he was the older brother, and his best friend in the show was a character named Boner. that was what he was called on the show. That was basically his name that everybody knew him as. And even as a kid, I remember watching that, being like, what, knowing what that reference was, thinking to myself, like, what, this is so bizarre, like that this guy's name is Boner in the show. Makes more sense now when I look at it through a different lens. And just for kicks, because it reminded me of that when I was a kid, I looked this guy up because I don't remember the actor's name. And so I did, let's see here. I did find a write-up on him, which I just found very interesting. So his name was Andrew Koenig, and his father was an actor in Star Trek, so he's a child of an actor. And, sometimes when you're researching some of this stuff, at least for me, you come across things where you just get, your spidey senses just goes up on what the fuck is really going on here. And this is one of those, I didn't expect anything. I didn't know who this guy was. I remember the character. I looked him up. And then you see here, he's the son of this Star Trek actor. And then you get this weird blurb here from this writer, Harlan Ellison, who spoke of the young Koenig, Andrew Koenig, who was in the Growing Pains show, by his given first name of Josh, as being the inspiration for his story, Jeffy's 5. And his quote here is just really strange to me. I had been awed and delighted by Josh Koenig, and I instantly thought of just such a child who was arrested in time of the age of 5. Jeffy is in no small measure is Josh, the sweetness of Josh, the intelligence of Josh, the questioning nature of Josh. End quote. This story went on to win the 1975 Nebula Award, whatever these things are, for Best Short Story. I don't know who this person is, this writer, but that is a strange, you can see him there, Harlan Ellison, who I looked into him, and he's kind of this eccentric figure. Anyway, but that's just a very strange quote regarding a 5-year-old kid who's not yours. I just found that very odd, and kind of like my spidey senses went up. Anyway, this Andrew Koenig guy, unfortunately, did seem to take his own life by hanging himself at a park in Vancouver, allegedly. So I did notice that, just kind of got up to really wonder, what really happens to, some of these people as they get older and they're in this industry of just filth all the way around. And in closing, I wanted to just share some of these, a news article from the Daily Mail, and, regarding, it's just funny because a lot of these things, as you can see by the headline here, Nickelodeon was infiltrated. This was just in March, I believe, of this year this came out. It's almost like they're doing damage control by us, insinuating that Nickelodeon was just completely asleep, just like Disney at the wheel, and they were infiltrated by these predators, and they have no idea how it happened. They were, these predators got together and, did this coup d'etat, and the channel employed 5 convicted child molesters and 2 other accused pedophiles to work on the set. And it goes on and on about how there's Marty Weiss and this other guy, this is Zell Chanel, another convicted pedo, and they all, despite their convictions, somehow, there's Jason Handy, got signed on to work for Nickelodeon. And, I've noticed that the mainstream goes to great lengths to conceal, the overall in my opinion, networking of these things, where this is not just a couple of, pedos who got together and infiltrated. No, this is a sign of a systematic, issue that goes all the way to the top. That I don't think that Disney and they're just they don't know what happened. They just fell through the cracks. I think it's more of a sign that this type of vile, sinful, disgusting behavior goes all the way to the tops. And Nickelodeon and Disney, in my opinion, are hiring people of this ilk by design. That this is not just we don't know how all these people got hired. This is a very, very dark agenda. And the article does we don't know, and it just goes on. And you can see some of these just vile tweets from Dan Schneider, Ariana Grande, the constant references to the feet, and this just vile, and it goes on and on. Whose toe? It's just, and you can just get a sense of what these people are really about, and just the blatant brazenness of it all. But I will say, even with the Diddy stuff, man, they go to great lengths in concealing or never even bringing up the notion that this is that this could be some massive network. And no, it's just this one-off, and they go to great lengths. Even with Diddy, there's never mentioned anybody or Epstein even, that there's potentially people that are higher up than them that police are going to start investigating. It never comes up. It just never comes up, even with this. It's pedophiles all around, but no, it's not a network. There's nothing like that going on. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was the just strange kind of story about one of these young actors who had been over Brian Peck's house, and this guy Kyle Sullivan, who was 14 at the time, and he was talking about, I'll read here, that his house, going over his house, he says his house was a little off. He had a room that was just dedicated to vintage toys and comic books. This is, again, a grown-ass man. He converted his garage into a Planet of the Apes theme. And he says, I noticed a painting in the room that stuck out to me because it had nothing to do with Planet of the Apes. It was a birthday clown holding balloons. Kyle then mentioned that Brian got very excited when he asked about the painting, revealing how he flipped the thing around and showed that on the back. It said to Brian, I hope you enjoy the painting. Best wishes, your friend, none other than John Wayne Gacy. As mentioned earlier, John Wayne Gacy, serial killer, 33 victims in the 70s, the killer clown, because apparently he used to dress like one. I'm sure everybody's familiar with the story. And apparently he had a pen pal relationship while John Wayne Gacy was in prison. And he had kept a pile of letters and photos that he was showing people at the party and was very proud of it. So he has an autographed painting of John Wayne Gacy. He has just letters upon letters of their correspondence with each other, which... looking into this guy's background, I'll be honest, I didn't know anything about the John Wayne Gacy connection. Maybe he was just pen pals with this guy. But I just found that to be a very peculiar detail. Because if you look into, John Wayne Gacy's story, and again, we're portrayed with this lone wolf, the Lone Ranger, just doing all this on his own. But if you really dig into the backstory and the John Wayne Gacy, you see a lot of thoughts, and I guess you would call them conspiracies, that he did not act alone, and he was part of a network that was basically killing and running a child, essentially a prostitution ring for young boys. And that there's a lot of details that kind of paint the picture that he wasn't alone, and he was the fall guy eventually, just a patsy to pin it all on so it goes away. But if you start diving in, you'll see that it does seem to be that there was more to that story than just John Wayne Gacy. Not saying that they knew each other, him and Brian. I have no idea. I couldn't find that connection. But I did find that just an interesting, who the fuck would be pen pals with some guy who's, slaughtered 33 boys? That's somebody that you really, and the fact that he has one of those clown paintings framed in his living room, that's just strange. It's very bizarre. But again, you mention some of this stuff, and, people start to shut down because, you start to talking about, that there are these massive networks of these things and they could all be tied together. Well, people, that kind of starts to crash in their worldview. And, so here I am, fringes of the internet. I guess, I'd just be considered some, crackpot who's got my conspiracy hat on a little too tight. But, I'm open to suggestions, but this stuff I think goes much deeper and darker than any of us could ever imagine. Even the few people that are aware of this stuff, I think the true reality goes to places that are so dark and deep, probably I couldn't even fathom. Anyway, I appreciate you listening. I really do. Thanks. And thanks for spending some time here. And I hope everyone here has a blessed rest of your day. Appreciate it. Take care.